Go ahead.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the York County History Center tonight. I have a few announcements to go over, and then I'll introduce our speaker for this evening. First thing is that Saturday, August 28th, we will have an event going at the Colonial Complex along the same time as the York Arts Festival. If you want, you can come down and visit the Colonial Courthouse and have your likenesses taken by Kevin O'Malley, an early American art stylist, for only $6. We can also watch as we reconstruct an 18th century down mattress. And just a general note, due to the rise of the COVID Delta variant cases, we ask that all visitors please wear a face covering while they are visiting York County History Center facilities. As far as other programs go, on Sunday, August 29th, here at HSM, the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be presenting their next program with Aaron McWilliams from the Pennsylvania State Archives on the subject, how to navigate the Pennsylvania State Archives online resources. The next York County Writers Roundtable is set for 7 o'clock Thursday on September 2nd here at HSM. The speaker is Diminished Marie Miller, who will present Putting Newberrytown on the Map, Preserving Hometown History for Generations to Come. On Wednesday, September 15th, here at HSM, the York County Civil War the York Civil Roundtable will be featuring Matt Borders speaking on the topic, A Last Roll of the Dice, the Third Confederate Invasion of the North, 1864. Thursday, on September 16th, starting at 5 here at HSM, is the members' annual meeting. To ensure all members can safely participate, the organization has opted to host the annual meeting in a hybrid format, both in person and online via Zoom. If you are a member of the York County History Center, you can participate through Zoom. Just make sure to register beforehand. You can either come in person or call the front desk and they can help you get started. So this evening, I would like to present Craig Siewert, who will be presenting on his father's service and World War II.
And Korea.
And Korea.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for attending tonight. I want to give special thanks to Linda Bean for being persistent and getting me here tonight. I was supposed to talk last March, and it didn't happen for obvious reasons. Also want to thank my wife, who's been supporting me through this whole endeavor. She's also added some insights to the talk tonight, and she promised to keep me on time and pull the hook if I go over. Also, I'd like to thank the veterans who are in attendance and online tonight for their services and sacrifices, and also to their families who supported you all through your endeavors. I'm here to talk tonight about my father, Jack R. Siewert. He was a World War II vet, Korean vet, and he retired a lieutenant colonel in 1907. So I had a long career in the Army, and I'm not going to go past his Korean involvements, but I'm going to start tonight by giving you a little idea of who Jack Siewert was. He was born in Chicago, Illinois, 8 May of 1924, lived in Portage Park his whole life up until he was drafted in 1943 into the Army. He lived in a German-American neighborhood. His mother was directly from England. The reason she was here in the States is she had a cousin who her cousin and her parents were coming over to visit them. They were on the Lusitania when it was sunk. The parents died, the cousin lived. She recovered, convalesced up in Keswick, England, which is where my grandmother was from. When she got better, my grandmother accompanied her back to the United States, and my grandmother stayed, from like 1920 till she passed away. My dad, on my dad's side, he was second generation German. So I'm just giving you a little background there. Core values and traits. Start off, he was extremely loyal, goal-oriented, traditional, independent, reflective and quiet most of the time. Strong faith, courageous, detail focused. He always told me you never want to do anything halfway. Do it right or don't do it all. I heard that all my life, and it drove me nuts when I was younger, but I think it played out as I got older. He was principle-centered, had a strong sense of right and wrong. That routinely showed up throughout his life. Believe me, when I did stuff wrong, I knew about it. Strong family values. He always got himself involved in his wife's efforts and endeavors, his kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, and he also let them get involved in his activities, which was pretty special. He was, for my mother, he was a big-time caretaker. He had a very strong work ethic. He always told me the harder you work, the luckier you get. He loved history. It didn't matter where, what, or when the historic, he always got himself immersed in that. Big-time reader, stubborn as hell, and a caring, loving man. In addition, he was an avid gun collector, sportsman, and he loved boating and camping. After his Army career, he worked for all his Chalmers until 1984, and that was his second retirement. So his first career was Army through 70, and then he worked till 84 and then retired. When he was in high school in Chicago, he went to Carl Schurz High School. He participated, and this is kind of, you don't hear about that around here. He was a member of the varsity speed skating and fencing teams. And the fencing part will come up on a little bit later when he was in Europe at the end of World War II. I'll cover that a little bit. It's an interesting story. He was drafted in February of 43. He was processed through Camp Grant, Illinois. His dates of service went from 23 Feb 43 to 31 March 70 when he retired. In between, he was discharged as an enlisted man after World War II, and then went on to the GI Bill. He got a civil engineering degree. He also went through ROIC and ROTC. And he went through that when he graduated in 1950. He had distinguished military honors, and he was commissioned as a regular Army officer, second lieutenant. And so he had his background both in World War II, and then coming up it'd be Korea. It's difficult for me to sit here and talk about what my dad did, because I don't have all the details that he would be able to, talk about tonight. But I'm honored to speak about his Army career. I think he would be very happy to know that his legacy, the book, Outpost Kelly, at least some people have some interest. The other thing that came out of it, and the reason I'm able to talk with some detail, is he was an avid writer. After he wrote Outpost Kelly, which wasn't his first book he did in 1959. It was part of his responsibility with the Army at that point. It was the International Geophysical Year where they were testing rockets up into the upper atmosphere. He wrote the final report for that, and that was the first book he got. And it was pretty interesting, very technical, thick. So he had that background, but that was long before he wrote Kelly. As a youngster, I would always ask, and so would my sister, ask my dad, what did he do in the war? There's normal stuff that kids ask. Did he kill somebody, or was he shot at, or what was going on? And it was basically crickets. We couldn't get him to respond in any manner whatsoever. It took him until he was in his 80s, 1995, and we didn't know he was going to do this. He started writing on yellow legal pad the beginnings of Outpost Kelly. And at that point, it took him 11 years till he got the book published, and he was tenacious about it. In his high school experience, he loved, I think, speed skating more than he loved fencing, but he was much better at fencing than he was at speed skating. And you'll kind of get a feel for that in a little bit. When he was drafted in 43, after he graduated in June of 42, in August of 42, he tried to enlist with the Marine Corps, and he failed 2 physicals. Within about a week's period, he really wanted to go with the Marines. And the reason he failed his physicals, he had what was called white coat syndrome. I don't know if anybody's heard about that, but some people have it. And it's the reaction the individuals have to somebody that's like a doctor. When he went in for the Marine Corps physical, for some reason, his blood pressure elevated way above what the acceptable level was for the Marine Corps to accept him. He looked back after World War II was over, and he felt that he may not have made it through World War II if he got in the Marines, just looking at what the Marines went through. Once he got drafted, he ended up going through his basic training. And after his basic training and the testing they took him on, he went down to Texas A&M. And down there, he was put through some additional training and ended up getting selected for what's called the Army Specialized Training Program, the ASTP. And that program was developed in 1941 or 42 for the specific reason of putting the right mental capacity individuals through a full college course in 1.5 years. He was selected to go into engineering. There was people that were selected for languages, and there was people selected for medicine. He got selected for the engineering part. The program was canceled in 1944 for the reason that the Army at that point needed an additional 10 divisions for D-Day. And at that point, he was sent to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and he joined what was then a newly formed 440th Ordnance Heavy Automotive Maintenance Company. After his training there, the whole group was sent over to England. And what they did over there was predominantly keep the vehicles prepped for they didn't know the D-Day invasion was coming, but kept the vehicles prepped during that lead up to D-Day. And then just before D-Day, his group and a lot of other units started moving vehicles down to the docks and getting ready to go over to France. When he was in England and he was able to get on some leave, and I'll show you a picture. This is a picture of the just the certificate of the specialized training program that he received. And not a lot of people know about this. And then this was a picture that was taken of him by his relatives in England, up in Keswick. And that's my dad. And he was he liked to pose. I mean, I never realized he was a big poser until I started seeing a whole lot of his pictures. And you might get that flavor tonight when you see a couple more of the pictures I bring out. But this was a picture of my dad in 1944 when he was in England. And one little side note of when he was with the Army Specialized Training Program, one of his friends from Chicago also went into that program. And when it was disbanded, he got sent to the Easy Company 506 Parachute Regiment, which was the Band of Brothers group. And he went through on the combat side, whereas my dad went through on the support side from England to France. England was just keeping the vehicles ready, prepping to come over. When he was in France, they were told they were going to do a lot of maintenance. Everything was just getting foobarred, if you know what that means. And he ended up just basically doing, the whole group was just doing salvage collection, and the salvage stuff was being recycled for steel at that point. When the war ended, he was in France, and he ended up, they were prepping for being shipped over to the Pacific for the Japanese invasion of Japan. And then the war ended, and he ended up with his unit going back to England. He knew he wasn't going to be able to come home because of the service points earned until early 46. When he was there, he got a call in like early December of 45 to come in and see his commanding officer, and he was told that he was selected for a program through the State Department to go back over to France. And he was told at that point what they were trying to do was come up with a goodwill type competition between the US and the French, who had their nose out of joint. So what he ended up being asked to do, this takes him back to his fencing days. He was going to join a group of other Army individuals on a fencing team that was going to fence the French team in France. So he went back New Year's Eve, 46, got to Paris, and then from Paris, the next day or two, went to Biarritz, France, where he was trained by some French coach, fencing coach that was well known. I don't know the guy, but he was trained because they wanted to have this competition. He felt all along they were going to get their rear ends handed to them. And what they ended up doing is, I think they ended up with the 5 people fencing. They had 30 matches or 36 matches. No, 30 matches. The US won 6 and the French won 24. My dad, though, was able to win 2 of his matches. And the only reason I know about that kind of stuff a lot of times is he did monographs after he did his book. And this is a picture of him when he was in France. And that's my father. He ended up, was on this fencing team. And he ended up getting a medal. And this is the US and this is the French fencers that were involved. And there was an article in the paper that came out about what they did. And it was kind of an interesting side note, because before he went as a fencer over to France, he was acting as a military police. He said, he told me later, just to try to keep himself out of trouble when he was in England. So that's what he did. He then went back to the States, was discharged from the Army in April of 1946. And then he went on the GI Bill, got his engineering degree, went into ROTC, June 1950. He was a distinguished military graduate. Because of that, he received a regular Army commission as second lieutenant. From there, he had to do a combat arms tour, and that was a prerequisite. But his control branch in the Army, he selected Ordnance Corps. But when he went over, he was assigned to the 64th Tank Battalion, 3rd Infantry. He was the commanding officer for the 2nd Platoon, which was Charlie Company at that point. November of 51, he went to Korea, and he came home September of 52. The entire time that he was in Korea, he spent on the MLR, the main line of resistance. In 10 months, he told me this, in 10 months, he felt like he had every possible munitions fired at him except naval bombardment and aircraft, or obviously nuclear. So when he got through with his tour, he felt that Outpost Kelly was a defining moment in his life, for just the exposure that he got out of it. The era that he was in over there, because the war went from 50 to 53, was called the Outpost Wars. The most famous Outpost War or Outpost was Pork Chop Hill. And that happened about 8 or 9 months after he was there. And it's in an interesting side note, Vice President Pence's father was at Pork Chop Hill. And that's just a side story. Background for Kelly, he started writing this book in 1995. My dad took basically his own memories, photos he had, Corps of Engineering maps, letters that he sent home to my mother. And he would, I mean, these letters were not like, hey, honey, how you doing? I gotta go. I mean, they were pretty long letters that he formulated for the book. The Outpost Kelly, when he was there, was a battalion-sized infantry unit. When he got started writing, he used a legal pad. The first pass he made was 129 pages. Then he started getting a little smart. He bought a brother's word processor, and then he went even a little deeper, and to the whole family's support, he bought a computer. But I used to have to run over there almost daily to help him back up his manuscripts, because he didn't know how to put the floppy disk in and do all that. You'd think after enough times he would have picked that up, but he didn't. When he looked at the book, he asked some people that he knew, and they were people that were professional readers and stuff like that, to read the book. They came back to him and said, you know, this book is more like a, hey, what did I do for my summer vacation? And it had far too much military jargon. So then what he did, because he started questioning whether his memory was accurate, he went to the National Archives in Maryland, and he drove down there one day and got out the command reports for the 15th Infantry from that time period. After getting that, he went through those reports, gathered up the info and casualty data that he uses in the book. And he also then was told, you ought to contact the National Records Personnel Center in St. Louis and ask for the morning reports, which he did. And in February of 2004, he got the morning reports. After he went through all that, consolidated his thoughts, made notes, it came back in 2004, and he had at that point 72 pages of single-spaced computer draft done. Again, at that point, he went out and asked his friends to take the manuscript and read through it. They did, and they said it's still in need of additional details. So what he did was he contacted the 3rd Infantry Division, which he was a lifetime member of, and asked them for their membership list. And then he started making some phone calls. And he called up a lot of these people. Some of them wouldn't talk to him, some of them did. By the time he got through making these calls and notes, he had gotten a pretty good idea from 4 different individuals, because they were all there. Most of them were in the infantry, and because his platoon was the only armor unit in the whole area. So he talked to mostly infantry guys, and they gave him a pretty good idea of what they were going through during the assault on Kelly. And because he was about 1,000 yards away from this action when it took place. So he got a pretty good idea. He added that into the book. I'm not going to go through that part of it, but it's an interesting read. There was some people that he knew that were lost. So then after he got that through, he was still, what emerged later in July of 2004 was now 100 pages manuscript. He wanted to get this book published. He was thinking of doing it, self-publish the book, but he thought, no, I'm going to start making some phone calls. And he just started calling everybody in their possible publisher in the US. He finally was told to contact the University of Alabama Press, which, as it turns out, is the largest publisher of wartime books. He didn't know that. So he made a call on about lunchtime one day. He got the receptionist on the phone at the Alabama Press, University of Alabama Press, and he told him what he told her what he was doing, and she said, yeah, I think you want to talk to Dan Ross. Well, he didn't know who Dan Ross was. They put him through to Dan Ross. My dad told him what he was doing for the book, And Dan Ross turned out to be the executive editor for the Alabama Press. He was the guy in charge. And he said, I like your story, so send me the manuscript. He sent him the manuscript back and forth. After 7 revisions and multiple edits, between a whole litany of people, experts on Korea, experts on words and punctuation and spelling, they ended up 3rd of August 2006, the book was ready for publication. That was 11 years later. And when I talked to you earlier about my dad's work ethic, focus, detail, and he was stubborn, he just stayed after this. And I mean, he took this thing on family vacations with us. It was his passion at the time. After the book was published, it was nominated in 2007 for the Colby Award, which was named after a former CIA director. It was for excellence in military writing. So he was one of the books in 2007 that got nominated. It didn't win, but as a side note, Tom Clancy was one of the former winners of that in that category years before. So he felt pretty good about just being nominated. Now I'm just going to give you a little bit of flow through for what his involvement was for Kelly. The fighting for Kelly was 28 to 31 July 52. I want to show you a painting. Well, I'm going to show you a painting, but I'm going to first show you a picture, and then the painting will kind of be self-explanatory. Here's a picture of my dad when he was in Korea. He's holding a cigarette and he's reaching in his pocket. And what he was reaching in his pocket for was this lighter. And I didn't even know he had the lighter because he hadn't smoked since like the early 60s. But he was reaching in the pocket for the lighter. It's got the insignia of the 64th Armor Regiment on it. And that's what he was reaching into. Well, he wanted to do a portrait of this picture, but he wanted to give it to everybody in the family. That was his idea. And I'm like, well, do it. Because our daughter is an artist and she's also an art teacher. Well, my dad's like, no, I'm not doing it with me smoking. I'm like, well, what do you want to do? He says, well, I'm going to talk to Tessa and I'm going to come up with what I think would be a better picture. So my dad comes up with and has my daughter put binoculars in his hand. So this has ended up the picture that came from that original picture. So our daughter painted this. She had a heck of a time getting the dimensional stuff for the hands done. But then my dad took and made a lot of prints that he gave to the grandkids and our great grandkids. So a lot of there's probably 15 to 20 of these made. This was the original my daughter did a watercolor on. So that was pretty neat experience. That came out of just his activity on the book. So next, he arrived in where he was originally being assigned to the other, what was the name? He was supposed to report to the 2nd Battalion, 7th Infantry. He was part of the 3rd Infantry, 64th Regiment, but they needed their armor group that was where Kelly was on Hill 199. They needed to have those tanks taken down for maintenance. So he was told to report over there and backfill those guys that were going for maintenance. So what they did was they made an exchange. He got there on 13th July 52. I'm just going to digress a little bit because one of the things in the book that was interesting from my perspective was in January of 52, they were, I don't even remember where they were, but it was nighttime, about 2 in the morning. Everybody, they had their people out, on guard duty. They were mostly up in their tank turrets, but a lot of them were sleeping in the tents. And about 2 in the morning, he was awakened by a lot of gunfire, grabbed his pistol. He carried a military 38 special, and he also carried a 45. I don't know why he had both, but that's what he had. He ran out. The firefight only lasted about a minute. The one fellow that was up in his tank, which was 21, he had the rifle shot out of his hand by the Chinese. There was all kinds of fighting, and in the dark, they couldn't tell what had happened. When daylight came the next morning, or in the morning later, they went out and did an inspection. They found about 10 or 12 feet in front of the 21 tank, a dead Chinese who was shot twice through the sternum and the spinal cord. And they didn't take him. The Chinese were well known for not leaving their dead behind. They didn't want any casualty counts being reported by the other side. So he then did some more inspection of the area, and where his tent was located, they found an unexploded grenade. And he didn't know when the grenade was thrown, but he said, you know, it could have been when he was still in the tent sleeping. And if that would have happened, he told me and my sister, and this was when we were adults, you know, I might not have been here for this, nor to write the book. So, but that was an interesting side note that my dad had put in this book, just to explain, you know, what his involvement for our own edification. His unit, Charlie Company, arrived, like I said earlier, to Hill 199, which was the hill he was on, 13 July 52. The actual fighting for Kelly didn't happen until 28 July. And when he arrived, the UN US forces occupied the top of Kelly. His unit was made up of M46 tanks, and he made this model years ago. This is what the M46, for people that don't know, that's what the tank looks like. That was his 5 tanks in his unit. What turned into what was 1 week involvement turned into 4, almost 4. The M46s have a 90mm barrel. His mission was to provide direct fire support for the surrounding hills and for the infantry, because they were primarily trying to hold Kelly, but there was other hills around that also had Chinese and other American units on it. The Kelly was about 1,000 yards from his hill 199, which was basically point blank range for a tank. He was only able to get 2 tanks up on top of the hill, which is what the previous platoon could only get up. So they had a revetment in for 2 tanks. From basically the 3rd day that he got there, he said they received mortar fire pretty much every day coming in. He goes, I don't understand what was going on, because he said the Chinese were either aiming it for something else or they were terrible at what they were doing. Because he said the only time it ever hit was a quarter-ton, one of the quarter-ton units that they had built a bunker for, and a round landed right on that. They had built other bunkers for housing that his men stayed in. What was funny about the bunkers was the only bunker that was taken out was the one with the quarter-ton. None of the others, they all held up during the shelling. It began raining though, and the monsoon rains eventually with the mud just collapsed the units, he told me. Day 15, once he was there, was the 28th of July. 2000 hours, he said his hill started coming under attack with mortars. And then at 21:30, he said all hell broke loose over on Kelly, which is where our people were, up on Kelly. At the time, though, there was only 18 people manning that, the Outpost Kelly. It was G Company, 2nd Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment. On the 28th, the Chinese assaulted the hill and took it. My dad did not have any engagement at that point because we had friendlies on top of Kelly, so he wasn't allowed, but they did have mortar and artillery coming in, because they could guide it to the far side of the hill that they really couldn't see, but they had forward observers that were, I guess, early on telling them, where to go. Day 16, the 29th of July, the order was given to retake Kelly. At 5:30, his tanks fired up. They needed then to be running to use to make the turrets run, or they had an auxiliary and little power engine, little gas engine that they could start up if they needed it. They began firing shortly after 5:30. The rain started in, and because of how hot the barrels were getting when the rain was coming down, the gunner could not see his target through the tank telescope. So at that point, they had already done range cards earlier, 2 weeks before. So they got the range card, and this was the gunner's quadrant that my dad brought back from Korea. This was the quadrant they used to put it on the barrel to end up sighting, taking the azimuth and the range and then the elevation. And that's how they ended up continuing the fire support during this rainstorm. My dad had never run into the problem like this before, but after that, he knew full well how to take, what he was going to have to do. That was really the only time he had to use the gunner's quadrant. At 0600, they were told to cease fire because the infantry that was attacking Kelly at that point was reaching the top. They weren't able to capture the hill at that point, and they had to retreat. On that day, the casualty count was 2 dead, 23 wounded for the infantry going over. Day 17, that was 30 July, 0900, he said the rains pretty much had stopped. And this is my dad to a T. He said there was a Lieutenant Heinrich from the headquarters of the 64th Regiment Tank Battalion that showed up to tell my dad that his R&R had come up, and that Heinrich was there to relieve my dad, so my dad could go 5 days to Japan. He basically told Heinrich, I ain't leaving. And after Heinrich said, you're not going, he says, nope. He says, this is your ticket out. He said, nope, I'm staying. Heinrich then told him that he had informed his CO before he left to tell my dad that my dad was going to turn him down. And that's what my dad did. So that was a little tidbit about, where his loyalties ran. The same day, 1500 hours, he went to a meeting, they called a meeting back at their battalion command, which is down the hill from where he was. And they were told the next day on the 31st at 04:30, there was going to be a battalion level strength attack on Kelly, and that he was to start providing fire support at first light. So when his orders were to lay on the various hills with his 2 tanks, his orders were to lay white phosphorus shells for smoke screen purposes up on the hills, and then start hitting it with HE, heavy explosive shelling. So he went back, told his guys, the 2 people, or the 2 gunners for tank 21 and 22 were the ones up on the hill. That morning on the 31st, which was the 18th day he was there, at 04:30, they got the tanks going. The 22 tank, they were trying to drive it back up into the revetment because they were trying to keep it out of sight from the Chinese. It threw a track because of the mud. So he couldn't get the 22 tank into where he needed to have it for them to start shelling. And what his responsibility was, he was supposed to cover the left flank, which was what he called a hill. 317 was over here. Kelly was more out in front of him, maybe a little bit to my right, and they couldn't get the 22 tank in position. So what he did was with the 21 tank being the only tank that could provide direct fire support, at 0720, they began firing. And the way they did it is my dad basically formed with his other group, the other part of his platoon down the hill. They all came up and they formed what we call a Chinese fire brigade. And they basically took shells from the 22 tank and moved them over to the 21 tank, because the 21 didn't have enough shells, either phosphorus or heavy explosive, high explosive. At about 08:15, they were told to stop firing because the infantry had gotten to the top of the hill. And after it was done, my dad did an inventory, and in 40 minutes, his tank 21 shot 109 rounds out of it. And he said it was just incredible. The guy that was in there was just blazing, away, firing. They ended up taking the hill and holding it. When he went to report to the commanding officer down the hill later that day, the commander told him he did a hell of a job. And my dad told him he did it with only one tank. And the commander said he didn't believe him. And he asked him, how did you do it? And my dad said, he told him about the Bucker Brigade, which was at that point, he said there was no tank doctrine that he was trained in that would allow him to do it. But under the circumstances, that's the only thing they could do. So his commander just really praised him for the help that he made. I mean, when they were firing, they actually blew up a large, what appeared to be a large ammunition dump that the Chinese had put up on the hill. And there was one round that my dad distinctly remembered when it went in. There was a lot bigger explosion than what they expected. Day 21, Charlie Company, my dad's platoon, was relieved by the 15th Tank Company. Kelly was still in the hands of the UN forces, but later in September of that year, 52, the Chinese retook the hill and it was never retaken by the US or UN. That engagement that my dad was in total, they found no Chinese casualties because they always removed their dead. The UN casualties were 9 dead, 60 wounded. That was the whole engagement. In December of 52, the 3rd Infantry awarded my dad the Bronze Star for his efforts on that hill, and that's part of what the citation says. After the book was published, one of the things my dad wasn't expecting, but he was really humbled by, was the number of people, because what he did was he went and got the membership list of the 3rd Infantry, and he then had them, he called up the 3rd Infantry and had them put in their publication, and he had this book. And he got a lot of orders from the 3rd Infantry, because those are the people involved in this conflict. He received a ton of correspondence. And if you want to read any of them, I've got some stuff I can show you from people that, and these are just photocopies of, I mean, this was a handwritten note that the man wrote to my dad from Kelly, that he really didn't know a whole lot about what was going on detail-wise with all the other units and how they were deployed over those 3 or 4 days. He also got calls from family members whose loved ones were lost in the conflict and they never really knew what happened. There was one specific infantry lieutenant that my dad knew of at the time that was wounded on the first assault that they didn't take Kelly back, but then later died of his wounds. But he heard from these people through the book. So this is just one letter of, I'd say maybe 15 or 20. And for a book like that, what he wrote, he was surprised that it had that kind of impact and breadth in terms of how many people, especially the ones that were over there still alive, could see it or could read about it. So that was the legacy my dad felt the most proud of from the Outpost Kelly book. Just to give you a little more background on, he was married in 1951. He had 2 kids, me and my sister. And after the Army, I told you he worked for Hollis Chalmers for about 14 years. And that's pretty much the end of my talk on Kelly. If anybody, has any questions or wants to see any of this stuff in a little more detail, I'll be glad to show it to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Is the book available?
Yes, it is. You can go on Amazon. It's still in hard copy, hardcover and paperback, both. Still, I checked before I came because I figured somebody might ask me that, but you can still get it. So he was real happy with it. I mean, he always laughed when he get his royalty checks. They'd come in and be like $11, $6, and I don't think that anything ever went above 11. But he was always happy that he got the book published, and that was his main objective and goal. And he was very proud of it. And he stuck with it. I mean, God bless him. It took him a long time. And he's a very detailed individual, and he had to, I know it just, he had to struggle to get it down to what it is in here. I just know the way he was. So, and then afterwards he wrote these, this is the Outpost Kelly Monograph, which is basically a little background on how he came about writing the book. After he got back from Korea, he went back into the ordnance at Aberdeen Proving Ground. That's where I was born. And he got involved in the International Geophysical Year, which is this monograph. And they were basically doing the precursor testing of rockets in the upper atmosphere and lower outer space. And he went all the way up to, he was the fire safety range fire officer. He went up to Fort Churchill, Canada. When they were launching these things, his job was basically, if the rocket didn't go the way it was supposed to, he had to blow it up. And when he was up there, he actually shot and killed a polar bear that broke into the mess hall. And he actually shot and killed a Arctic wolf that also broke into the mess hall. And he actually brought the Arctic wolf hide home, which we still have. So that's a little, but that's another story that he went into. And then in 1959, he wrote the final report for that. And then that led up to NASA and then all the rockets that went up after that. And a lot of it was for the intercontinental ballistic missiles, and testing for that stuff. And it was pretty, he made National Geographics in 1958 for that effort. He was only standing in the picture they took of everybody putting the rocket together. So that was the background. Then he came back from that, and he went to get his master's at Babson College up in Massachusetts. After that, he got transferred to Germany, where we spent 4 years over in Germany. He was with User Command, and then he was a battalion commander for a maintenance battalion in Hanau, Germany. That was pretty neat for him to have that come back. He now was the commanding officer. And at that point, it was the largest standing battalion in the whole Army. And then they started having a huge drawdown because of the Vietnam War, veterans that were in Vietnam. They started pulling people out of Germany to go to Vietnam. Then when he came back from there, he went to the Command and General Staff School in Leavenworth. And this is just a side note, in his class, Colin Powell was one of the members of that class of 68. So, and then he had gotten completely fed up with the Army. He didn't even know why he went to the Command and General Staff School, because he wanted out. And then he retired in 70. He got fed up with all the lies and distortions that were going on coming out of the Johnson administration. He hated McNamara. I mean, I didn't even know who the guy was. I just knew he better never show up at our house. So that's a little more background all the way up to when he retired. So thank you very much, and everybody have a good evening.
Thank you.
I think I kept it under